KPBS On Demand is supported by Splatero, helping homeowners pay off debt by offering streamlined access to your home's equity with no additional monthly payments or new debt. Splatero provides a lump sum of payment in exchange for a share of your home's future value. Pre-qualification is available at splatero.com.
Welcome back to another edition of listener-supported KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. I'm Beth Accomando. The holidays are upon us, so what better time to think about spirituality? For some of us, movie theaters are like churches. They're places of worship, holy shrines where we sometimes have transcendent experiences. The new Star Wars film, The Last Jedi, just opened, and it restored my faith in the Force as something spiritual that anyone can tap into. No need for those ridiculous midichlorians that George Lucas described in his prequels. And those prequels, they tested our faith. They represented the dark times that Star Wars fans had to suffer through. We had to deal with questions about why we still believed. But most of us remain true to the Force, even if we question the wisdom of its creator. But our reward has been a new trilogy and a new standalone film that have brought us out of the dark times and into the light. But Star Wars movies are not the only source of spirituality in the movies, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I was raised Catholic, but I must confess, I hadn't been in a church for decades. So when a friend sent me information about a sermon at a Unitarian church and suggested I go, I hesitated. But then I saw the topic of the sermon, horror movies as spiritual practice. And the woman giving the sermon, Catherine Buffington, was a geek like me, but one with a lot more impressive credentials. In addition to making geeky craft projects and engaging in role-playing games, things you might leave off a resume, she has a master's degree in women's studies, where she did research centered around the Japanese feminist movement and modern manga. She's written an interactive fiction novel that combines classic ninja manga and movie tropes, and she teaches popular culture criticism as part of her composition classes at Palomar College. All this led me to put aside my fears and distaste for organized religion, and on October 22nd, I stepped back into a church. I have to admit, I was surprised that instead of traditional hymns, I was treated to a zombie song to open the service.
Madame Zombie, elle est méchante.
Mrs. Zombie, she's nasty.
Et sa sœur est plus méchante.
But her sister is neither.
Oui, sa sœur est plus méchante.
Yes, her sister is neither.
Mais sa mère est la plus méchante.
But the mother is the meanest.
Voyez-vous les zombies là?
Les zombies.
Then, Catherine Buffington began her sermon with this.
Horror movies teach us that you never, ever go into the basement alone without a flashlight. Horror movies teach us that if you want to survive, you need to live a virtuous life. Horror movies teach us that you shouldn't buy haunted real estate, no matter how good the deal. Just don't. Horror movies teach us that you should never, ever split up from the group. Horror movies teach us that evil is an undeniable presence in our lives. And horror movies teach us that fear is a lifelong condition, one that must be conquered so it will not consume us. Ever since I became a Unitarian Universalist, I've been puzzled by the lack of discourse around topics of fear and evil. Initially, I attributed this desire of many UU congregations to distance themselves from a more traditional fire and brimstone brand of religious discourse. Fear, after all, is often a symbolic tool of the more patriarchal, obey-at-all-costs mindset that some institutions use to cement social conservatism. Fear has taken a front seat in much of our political discussion these days. And fear is a value that is aligned with the sort of political power that we find repugnant. Machiavelli tells us that it's ideal for a leader to both be feared and respected. But in the event that the leader can't have both, fear is the more ideal choice because it is a constant of the human condition. So perhaps it's logical that modern UUs avoid talking about fear and evil and spend our time thinking about how to fight it instead. But constantly fighting a faceless presence or an ideology is tiring. Lately, fear and evil have felt like constant companions. Dealing with them is draining. And this feeling couples with shame. Shame at admitting exhaustion or ignoring the problems that cause fear and doubt. The most important way I've come to deal with the existence of fear and evil is through horror movies.
Okay, I was hooked. I wanted to know more, and I wanted to invite her on my podcast to talk more about this notion of horror movies as spiritual practice. But since we met for the interview on the day The Last Jedi opened, I decided we needed to chat just a little bit about Star Wars as spiritual practice. But fear not, no spoilers about the new film.
Just breathe. Now, reach out. What do you see? Light. Darkness. The balance.
Star Wars has been in our pop culture since 1977, and this notion of the Force seems primed for incorporating into spiritual practice. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you're a Star Wars fan, so what has this meant for you?
It's such a treat to see that the new films are fantastic. When it comes to spirituality, I had a friend who used to joke with me that she didn't go to church, but every Sunday they watched one of the Star Wars movies. And I always think about that in the way that the Jedi Order in particular, how their costumes and their techniques, as much as we see them in the films, mirrors meditation practice and some Buddhist and Shinto philosophies, and how it draws on mythology from all over the world. And it's a wonderful amalgam of all these things. And when you sit in that theater and you see it for the first time, it's like my heart sings. It's amazing.
And, I mean, is that something you see that fans kind of incorporate? I mean, after the first trilogy, it felt like there was this real sense that what the Force was this thing where anyone could tap into it, and it had this sense of kind of unlimited potential, but without ignoring the fact that there was also a danger of evil.
The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, it penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together.
Well, there are people who do try to practice the Jedi lifestyle. It is a real thing to them. I think it's a wonderful metaphor that it works so well on so many levels for so many different types of people. If you think about it, it could be a divine force. It could be something innate to human beings, or in this case, all people in the Star Wars galaxy. But the idea that there is a force greater than ourselves, whether it's God or gods, plural, or some higher plane of reality that we can reach through our own willpower, that's a really salient idea that dates all the way back to Renaissance humanism, if you want to think of it like that.
For me, the first trilogy is the one that I tapped into in terms of this notion of the Force. And I have to say that when the first prequel came out, The Phantom Menace, and they introduced that notion of the midichlorians.
I've been wondering, what are midichlorians?
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
Inside your cells, yes. And we are symbionts with them.
Symbionts?
Life forms living together for mutual advantage. Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force.
It made me go, wait a minute. that's not what I was thinking it was all about. And did that
No.
kind of jar it for you a little bit?
Definitely. And honestly, like many fans I know, my ideas that never happened. It was a hiccup. It was like an outtake that somehow weaseled its way into the film. I don't know. But yeah, that does take away from it in some major way that I think is greatly detrimental to the universe as a whole. I wish George Lucas had thought that through a little bit more clearly. Maybe he wanted to make this more firmly science fiction and a little less of the spiritual, perhaps, but that's the Star Wars universe's great power. Sure, it's science fiction. It's a space opera, but I think it has so many other elements, spiritual storytelling that pull from so many spheres that so many people adore and love and that resonate with them. And so by putting it more firmly in that one place, perhaps I think that was a fatal error in some ways. So.
Now, the reason I invited you to come on my podcast was I have probably not stepped into a church since I was married and then divorced decades ago. And I was raised Catholic, so you can't shed that. It's always there. And a friend of mine forwarded a notice saying that, there's going to be a talk about horror movies as spiritual practice at a Unitarian church here in San Diego. And I was, okay, this may be the thing that gets me to step foot back into a church. And I did. And so you gave a sermon on this. So how did that come about and kind of what motivated you?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for coming back. And honestly, I was like you for a long time. I wasn't raised Catholic, but I was raised Christian, and my parents and I had a huge falling out about it at some point. And for a long time, stepping into a religious building made me feel almost physically ill. I felt very alienated from that, even though, there were many good things about Christianity in many ways. But when I joined the Unitarians, as they're a very progressive denomination. One of their pitches is like, we welcome everyone, agnostics, atheists, people of all religious faith traditions. And so when we joined, I thought, oh, wow, maybe this is a place where people would like to think about the way that I came back to spirituality or any kind of religious thought, which was really through pop culture. I think particularly of 6 Feet Under as a show that made me start thinking about religious practice in a way that I hadn't before, as we see one of the main characters, David Fisher, trying to reconcile his sexual identity with his religious identity.
Why does being a deacon mean so much to you now? It wasn't even a consideration for you a week ago.
Look, I know you think it's naive, but I see it as a chance to make a difference. Make the world just a little more tolerant.
David, we have our own church in West Hollywood, which means the other churches in the diocese don't have to tolerate us. Frankly, I resent the notion that I need to be tolerated.
So what, we should just allow ourselves to be ghettoized?
Why do you embrace an organization that doesn't embrace you?
The church embraces everyone.
Oh, yeah, right. Hate the sin, love the sinner? The operative word being hate.
What is with you? The other night you said you liked the idea.
Had a chance to think.
The way that was written was so meaningful to me. I hadn't ever considered, stepping back into a church, or a religious setting in that way. And I started paying attention, in other contexts and wondering, what messages was I missing, perhaps? And because, pop culture is my great love in life, in one of the many, actually, but that was where my primary source was. As for this sermon itself, I had become a worship associate, which basically is somebody who helps run the services and, kind of organize things and do the shorter readings at the beginning and the end. And in the summers, we usually have a series of guest speakers so that our minister can take some time to recharge and study and so forth. And I, almost as a joke at one point at one of the worship associate meetings, said, oh, I'd like to do a talk about horror movies. And our minister's face kind of lit up and she said, that's the best idea. And I said, oh, okay. And so it didn't work out. I think by the time I thought of this, we were full for the summer. But then she said, well, why don't you do it in October? It makes sense then. It's close to Halloween. It's fantastic. And we do have Halloween itself, we have a really lovely Day of the Dead celebration that I enjoy very much. But that's how it came about.
Now, you specifically talk about horror movies as spiritual practice. So what was it that made you focus on that genre?
Well, as I put it in the sermon, one time back in the fires in 2007, this was a time of great stress. And our houses weren't in danger, but, it was scary. And on the Friday morning of the sudden week that we had off work that nobody wanted, my husband turned to me and he said, I can't take the news anymore. we can't wait around. And I said, well, let's go see a movie. And we went and we saw 30 Days of Night. Not a great film. I love it, but I acknowledge that it's not the best of anyone. And no offense to 30 Days of Night fans, I've heard the comic is much better. But when we came back from that, my mother said, oh, did you see a movie? And I said, yes. And she said, what did you see? And I told her, and her jaw dropped, and she looked at me, and she said, why would you see that? And thinking about the answer to that question, I began to wonder, why had we wanted to see fictional scares when there was real life horror all around us? It had fixed something inside of me, and I guess I hadn't recognized that need until I went and saw it. And so that was the jumping off point. And I've been thinking about it ever since. And yeah, that was really how we got started with that.
So what is kind of the fundamental underpinnings of this notion of horror as spiritual practice? What kind of, when you sat down to write that sermon, what was kind of the thing that crystallized that said, like, all right, this is the point where I have to start to explain to these people who may not know anything about the points of reference I'm making?
Yeah. I think horror films allow us to deal with fear in an abstract setting where we have a great amount of control. When you're watching at home, you can pause it. You can get up. You can go get snacks. You can turn it off. You can turn on more lights. You can have fewer lights. You can snark at it with your friends. You can do anything. And even when you're in the theater, okay, maybe you went on opening night and it's super crowded, but then you're with a big group of people. And that is some of the most enjoyable movie-going experiences that I think we can ever have, right? That we're in there and everyone is feeling the same emotions and people are reacting, and it becomes this primal type of storytelling that we don't get quite as much anymore. I really don't. I mean, Star Wars is a great example of, a collective story that many people are aware of and talk about in great detail. But shorter stories, and horror movies in particular, they allow us to have that shared experience of that primal kind of storytelling in a very healthy way.
And how does that translate into spiritual practice? I mean, most people think of spiritual practice as, going to church or participating in certain kind of organized things as part of the religious practice and having this sense of morality or, guidelines or rules. So how do those horror movies then translate into a kind of spiritual practice?
Well, obviously, you don't have to sit and meditate. You don't have to, get your rosary out after you watch a horror film. It's very much on your own terms, which appeals to me as a person who's, I don't want to say recovering, but appeals to me as a person who comes from a deeply rooted place of skepticism. All right. And so for me, the spiritual practice involving horror movies involves being close to other people. It involves confronting fears that I have. And sometimes I know exactly what they are, and going into it, I know, what this is going to be, and I'm going to concentrate on drawing strength from seeing another person overcome those fears. And other times I don't know, and it surprises me. And there's a wonderful part. I think Jewish tradition emphasizes this a lot, but you have to be comfortable with being made uncomfortable. And that's what horror movies are meant to do. You are not supposed to be comfortable. And so how you make that into a spiritual practice is really up to you. Usually what I do, I think about it a lot afterwards. I try to write about it. I try to say, what can I learn from that? If I didn't like it, how come? Or if it provokes an extreme emotional reaction into me, I try to get to a quiet place with that in my mind and examine what was actually happening. And if I went and saw it with a bunch of friends, we talk about it, we might laugh about it, we might make fun of parts of it. And really, even snarking at something I think has tremendous power. Pointing out ridiculousness in things that frighten us makes them have, less hold on us. And anything that does that is always good.
So if we were to look at maybe your conventional or your typical slasher film.
On a June night in 1980, Friday the 13th, 12 of her friends were murdered. Why should Friday the 13th, 1981 be any different? Friday the 13th, Part 2. The body count continues. 14.
If you were to look at something like that, are you getting a lesson from that? Can you find some commandment in them? Is there some sense of something that communally we can draw on and learn from that experience?
Absolutely. So there are two things that happen, I think, in a conventional slasher film. First of all, there is a very black and white morality that usually pervades the whole story. The idea that if you do bad things, you suffer for them. And, viewers are welcome to take away from that what they will. Very often when I think of slasher films, I think of the old EC horror comics, like Vault of Horror and, the Tales from the Crypt, where we see this very much this pagan or Wiccan idea that if you do evil, it comes back to you threefold. And so on one hand, there's this very obvious morality lesson for you. But then there's also this collective purging of bad emotions, right? Aristotle talks about this in his work on rhetoric, specifically on drama, where he talks about a good drama, and for him, this is Greek tragedy, which has a lot in common with modern slasher films, in my opinion. Not entirely, but quite a lot. But where there's a sense of a building of unclean thoughts, and then by participating communally in this tragedy, you get to this moment of catharsis or purgation where you're able to purge those bad thoughts. And so in a slasher film, typically we have kind of a combination of horror and mystery where, who is the killer? What is his or her motive? Usually his, but sometimes her. If it's a torture porn movie, what diabolical ways will they hurt the characters? How do we feel about those characters? But we usually build towards some kind of resolution. And hopefully at the end of that, I think in a good horror film, we have some moment of closure that we don't otherwise get. Real life stories aren't that clean. But in a horror film, you have a moment where you're like, okay, it's over now. And it's clear. Or maybe, sometimes filmmakers go for the gotcha ending where jump scare, it's not. But even so, you've had that moment of catharsis, and it's a really wonderful experience.
Now, slasher films are kind of on a simple plane. They're not. There's not a lot of complexity. You can read things into them, but there is this clarity to who's good, who's bad, and very clear responses to what these films are. There's some other science fiction and horror, which where ideas become a little more complex. One film that you mentioned that you liked is the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Doctor, will you tell these fools I'm not crazy? Make them listen to me before it's too late! Listen to me. Please listen. If you don't, if you won't, if you fail to understand, then the same incredible terror that's menacing me will strike at you!
They come from another world, spawned in the light years of space, unleashed to take over the bodies and souls of the people of our planet, bringing a new dimension in terror to the giant superscope screen.
Whatever intelligence or instinct it is that can govern the forming of human flesh and blood out of thin air is fantastically powerful, beyond any comprehension.
So what does this film say to you?
Oh, this film plays on the universal human fear of being the last person or being the only one in a group. I love this movie. I love it despite its flaws. It's very much of its time, but it's so beautifully shot. Some of these scenes are so eerily and perfectly composed. And the speeches that the villains give, that the others give, and I want to use that other with a capital O, right? The others who've been taken over by the pods and made into these emotionless creatures. One of them has this line about, this town was a place where people with problems lived.
Then out of the sky came a solution. Seeds drifting through space for years took root in a farmer's field. From the seeds came pods, which have the power to reproduce themselves in the exact likeness of any form of life.
So that's how it began. Out of the sky.
Your new bodies are growing in there. They're taking you over, cell for cell, atom for atom. There's no pain. Suddenly, while you're asleep, they'll absorb your minds, your memories, and you're reborn into an untroubled world.
Where everyone's the same?
Exactly.
What a world. We're not the last humans left. They'll destroy you.
Tomorrow you won't want them to. Tomorrow you'll be one of us.
I love Becky. Tomorrow will I feel the same?
There's no need for love.
No emotion. Then you have no feelings, only the instinct to survive. You can't love or be loved, am I right?
You say it as if it were terrible. Believe me, it isn't. You've been in love before. It didn't last. It never does. Love, desire, ambition, faith. Without them, life's so simple, believe me.
I don't want any part of it.
You're forgetting something, Miles.
What's that?
You have no choice.
And there's this wonderful push-pull between that desire we have to not worry about things, to not have those problems, and the fear that by not worrying about those problems, we lose something important in ourselves. That story is just so perfect. And I think it's held up well in its retelling, but I really got to say that original is where it's at. And beautiful black and white. It's fantastic.
Well, and to me, it gets to a very core fear I have. Maybe it's not specifically spiritual, but the most terrifying thing in horror is loss of identity.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
That gets right to that issue.
Well, and there's a spiritual side to that, too. We live in a very individualistic society. And for better or for worse, in most cases for better. But the idea then that we could lose what makes us us, what makes us not, I hesitate to use the word special because it's been overused and overdone so much, but what makes us uniquely, our sense of self, is very important. And the idea that losing that is a possibility, a distinct possibility, even in fictional context, is enough to shake a lot of people to their spiritual core. What are you going to do if you are not you? What if you are part of that hive automaton mind? That's very eerie and unfathomable for most of us.
Well, and that kind of dovetails into a particular kind of horror film I love, which are zombie films.
They give me panic attacks. I have to say, it's very funny that I ended up doing this sermon because I think in many ways I'm kind of a wimp when it comes to horror film. I have a sweet spot, a genre I love, but zombie films, I watched 28 Days Later and it gave me nightmares for weeks afterwards. But I can see what a powerful film it is. It's so eerie. All those shots of London. Mm-hmm. And at first, that light, that beautiful sunlight they got by shooting, I think they were like at 4 a.m. or something. Mm-hmm. But to see him completely solitary wandering through the city and then the shock of encountering the infected, that scene, that opening scene is just terrifying in so many ways. And yes, yes.
Now see, my terror comes from a different perspective on that, which is that loss of identity.
Yes.
And so for me, zombie films epitomize kind of the things I fear the most,
yes.
which is the combination of the monster could be someone you knew.
Mm-hmm.
You know, here's something coming at you that could have been your parents, your kid, your best friend.
Oh, yes.
And then the other side of that is, if you become a zombie, how aware are you of what you're doing, and what's your ability to stop what you're doing? And, you know, recently we've had this trend of what's called the self-aware zombie, which are zombies that are kind of know who they are. It started with Bub in Day of the Dead, where, you know, he's kind of getting that he holds a book and suddenly you see like, oh, maybe he's remembering what he was. And recently we've had a comic version of that in Warm Bodies.
What am I doing with my life? I just want to connect. Why can't I connect with people? Oh, right. It's because I'm dead. I wish I could introduce myself, but I don't remember my name. I think it started with an R. That's all I have left. It's kind of a bummer. I shouldn't be so hard on myself. I mean, we're all dead. This is my best friend. We even have almost conversations sometimes. They call these guys bonies. They'll eat anything with a heartbeat. I mean, I will too, but at least I'm conflicted about it.
That, to me, gets to the same kind of core idea as Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Exactly.
It's a different context, but it's still this notion of it's your body, you look like you, but you no longer are doing the things that you would want to have control over.
Exactly. And you're committing terrible acts of violence to boot, you know, or things, you know, that we find incredibly taboo, like cannibalism, for instance, that, you know, and like I said, there's a lot of violence that Aristotle in his work would, if we could bring him forward in time, I think he would look at horror and say, oh yeah, this is tragedy just juxtaposed and updated.
There's another film that doesn't deal with body snatching, but is a film that builds on something that's very key to horror, which is this notion of dread.
Yes.
And It Follows.
This thing, it's gonna follow you. Somebody gave it to me, and I passed it to you, back in the car. It could look like someone you know, or it could be a stranger in a crowd. Whatever helps it get close to you. It can look like anyone, but there's only one of it.
Help! Help!
There's nothing really overt in it, except for maybe the opening scene.
The opening scene, yes.
Where there's a gruesome bit of violence to kick it off, and then there's really nothing else except the dread of what might happen. And so how does this play into your spiritual practice?
That was fantastic. And I just say that movie was so creepy. And we talk about edge of the seat entertainment. I think that one was I can't take a breath entertainment, because I was sitting in the theater and my hands were I didn't have white knuckles, but I was gripping the arms of the chair real hard, and I had to keep thinking to myself, like, okay, breathe. There's one jump scare in the whole thing. And that's everything else is all this building sense of dread. And it's fantastic. I cannot recommend it enough to anyone who hasn't seen it. It's just wonderful. As for spiritual stuff in that movie, the idea that there is something wrong with you that is passed from person to person, this idea of a contagion. And this metaphor, this can be just about anything. This can be an STI, this could be the wrong kind of ideas or ideologies, this could be vampirism, this can be werewolf stuff, this can be just about anything. The idea that there is something inherently wrong in human contact that could come back to haunt us. But this movie, I thought the catharsis in it was just so intense. And it was a moment when we get to the final confrontation scene where I thought I was gonna pass out. It was so intense. That movie was so terrifying that we got home and I told my husband, I said, you need to go look upstairs. And he said, but by the logic of the story, I'm like, nope, go look upstairs. You have to check. I can't handle it. If there's a tall man in my bedroom, I will freak out. It was, yes. But I think the idea that was so potent in that, and this is, it's obviously sexual contact in this movie that spreads this, but the idea that by doing something, and consensually, because both the main character was doing this of her own free will, out of her own desire, by doing something that mistake would not be erased. And this delves into a lot of people's anxieties, and my own in the past, that one mistake will come back to haunt you and you can't erase it. You can't go back in time. You can't undo that particular thing. And by contemplating that and, putting it in that extreme fictional setting, I think you start examining the idea that, a mistake is that bad and saying to yourself, well, perhaps not. And part of spirituality and part of watching, and horror movies as spiritual practice, conquering your own fears, I think, is one of the greatest things we can do in life, because then we can move forward. We can get things done. You free up mental space that was being taken up by anxiety or depression or sad thoughts or phobias or fear, and you have so much more energy to do great things with. And so with It Follows, you have an opportunity to examine a profoundly anxiety-making premise. And then, on multiple levels too, like on a personal, on a person-to-person level, on a political one, and then say, wait a minute, that automatic thought makes no sense. Maybe I don't have to keep thinking that. Or maybe I have to remember that this isn't like some uninvited stranger in my house that's going to try and mess with me, because that thing has no power over me. That's one of the greatest things about a film like that it gives you that chance. Very few things in life give you that chance. And a lot of people don't reach out and take it.
Well, and I think the way that film progresses, because when it starts, you don't really know anything. You don't even know from the first if it's transmitted sexually or...
It's true.
And so that taps into... Because I think a lot of people today have this kind of unfocused anxiety where they're not... They can't point to one thing and say, like, I'm... only it's it's the fires or it's the president or it's the economy
exactly.
Or there's this kind of unfocused sense of like, oh, things just aren't feeling good. And that film allowed these characters to kind of delve into that as they're trying to figure out what it is that is making them experience this sense of dread.
That's true. The other thing I liked about that film was that the characters made smart choices for the most part. Sometimes one of the things we mock in horror film is like people making foolish decisions. I mean, extremely foolish. Or perhaps I would like to say very human decisions, because a lot of people cannot leave well enough alone, right? That's one of our greatest flaws and strengths in one place. But in It Follows, I thought the characters made some very interesting decisions and ones that were logical. And when they were motivated by fear, I thought, yeah, that's the choice I would make in that situation too. I'd be terrified and making bad decisions all over the place. And
communal decisions. Because a lot of it had to do with, a lot of times in horror films, you get the let's split up kind of thing. And this was a lot about these kids getting together and saying, what can we do to help each other? How can we watch over each other and try to prevent this from getting any worse?
Yeah, and for them to even try to confront the monster when we learn, or I don't want to say monster, but maybe the force of this thing. There's the force again. But when they finally decide to confront this thing, we get the impression that other people haven't even thought about that. That they're maybe the first to try and sort out what it is exactly, what its weakness might be. And that's a really fascinating thing. And then, of course, our parting shot at the end throws some ambiguity into whether or not they have succeeded. But I still adore that movie. I probably can't handle it again for a while, but I still adore it. That's how I feel about a lot of horror film. It's not something I view over and over again. But maybe more comedic ones I would. But, it's still a fantastic experience.
These films we've talked about so far were American films. And this notion of passing something on comes up in the Japanese film The Ring, which was wildly popular, based on a manga. It had multiple sequels. It inspired, I think there was a Korean version, an American version. The notion is that this videotape is the thing that spreads the contagion. And what I found really interesting and this raises some cultural issues, is that, and sorry for anybody who hasn't seen the film, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but the choice that's made by a character at one point is this sense of, we need to put it to an end, and she decides to pass this on to somebody who's like on their deathbed. And it's this kind of sense of, how do we resolve this in a way that does the least harm? And it was like a different way of thinking of approaching the problem that I don't think you'd see in an American film.
It's a very... So the first time I ever saw The Ring, it was in Japanese with no subtitles. And my language abilities were about... I like to say I was like at a 4th grade reading level, but, you know, I could understand a lot. But this movie goes very fast, and there's a lot of ambiguous dialogue in it. So we were watching it with a Japanese friend of ours, and we would pause about every 20 minutes, and I would ask her questions. I'd be like, you know, what's going on here? Why is that guy doing that thing? And she would always answer. She would say, I don't know. I didn't read the manga. I don't know. And I'd say, oh, okay. And so I was really mystified for a long time. What was the scare factor in this, other than, you know, our final, the monster, you know, other than Sadako, who was undeniably very, very frightening looking. And it wasn't until years later I was doing some research in my master's program, and I realized that story was based on an old Japanese folktale, the Yotsuya Kaidan, which has been retold, I think, some amazing number of times. I think it's been retold, I want to say, at least 40 or 50 times in different film settings. It's it's a popular stage play. Imagine if a local urban legend like the Jersey Devil or the Chupacabra got the big screen treatment like about every 5 years. Like, this is how popular this story is. And you've probably, if you've seen the Hokusai print of the samurai facing off against the lantern, that's that story too. So the idea, a samurai has wronged this woman, and she, depending on the version of the story you read, she either kills herself or he kills her, and then her spirit does not rest. She comes back to haunt him. She will not let go. And so the idea that this is a very animistic tradition, I think this is very reflective of the Shinto tradition as it stands, that emotion is so great that it can scar a landscape, or it can create something permanent that's indiscriminately greater than itself. This explains why we have a cursed videotape. And so I think to some American audiences, or people who weren't familiar with this religious practice, they thought, what? You know, why not just not watch the videotape, you know, or why not, you know, and who's passing videotapes around anyway, that kind of thing. But it's a wonderful film in that I think it challenges both your cultural preconceived notions of what's scary, and it allows, you know, the viewer to kind of think, okay, this isn't, you know, how I view horror, but there is this idea that's still really potent in another context and setting.
And I just like the way they resolved it. Again, to me, it seemed like it was a different cultural take, where Americans have a lot of, like, you know, kill it, destroy it. But this was
end the cycle.
This was a way of thinking, let me think of a way to end the cycle without, like, hurting others.
Yeah, it's true.
And it was really the first Ring film was amazing. Now, you mentioned this notion of contagion, and you mentioned it in relation to vampires. So one of your vampire films you like is the Coppola version of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
I adore that movie. I love how ridiculously over the top it is. I love how the costumes are just in your face, and I love Gary Oldman as Dracula. I think he is having so much fun.
Welcome to my home. Enter freely of your own will and leave some of the happiness you bring.
Count Dracula.
I am Dracula. And I bid you welcome, Mr. Hart, to my house. You will, I trust, excuse me that I do not join you. But I have already dined, and I never drink wine.
I adore him. And I love that they kept a lot of the lines from the novel in there. I even love Keanu as Jonathan Harker. I think he is perfect for that role. It's really quite entertaining. But yeah, vampires are the ultimate blank slate. They can be whatever you want them to be. Dracula can be colonialism. He can be, like a conquering, like an oppressive force. He can be, disease. He can be rape. There's a very sexual dimension of that story, which some movies like to play up, others just kind of ignore. And we look at all our different vampire narratives and the evolution of the vampire. We've gone from Nosferatu to, I hesitate to say, Sparkle Pyre. I hope that is not a major stepping stone on our progression. But yes, I think that movie, although the ending is a little frustrating, I think that movie really gives the viewer an over-the-top invitation to the vampire mythos, and it just keeps being in your face the whole time. And it's ridiculous, and I love it.
Well, and Bram Stoker wrote this during the Victorian era,
Exactly.
which was all about repression, and especially
Yes.
repression of sexuality for women.
Exactly.
So this notion of a creature like a vampire freeing you of your inhibitions was something that tapped into a particular chord at that time.
Absolutely. And when you look at the novel in particular, there's some really interesting passages, particularly when Stoker is writing from Mina's point of view or Lucy's point of view, and he describes their repulsion particularly Mina's repulsion at seeing her friend become so open about her sexual desires and she uses the word wanton. This idea that women would actively pursue something is repulsive on apparently too many levels for Stoker and his readers. But one of my favorite parts of Dracula is that at one point when we know that Dracula is in Mina's room and something bad is going on there, the male characters stand around and argue about whether they should go into a lady's room uninvited. Because that's important. And in that moment, we see the values of the time magnified against, the horror of the story. And I don't think Stoker set out to be subversive, but I think in that particular scene, he nails it. He just nails it. It's perfect and wonderful. I want to give a plug here. If anyone hasn't checked out Becky Cloonan's illustrated edition of Dracula, you should absolutely look at it. She is a wonderful illustrator, and she brings out the sensuality and the predatory nature of Dracula in her beautiful illustrations. So I can't recommend that book highly enough.
And what does a film like this, or this notion of vampires, how does that tap into kind of a sense of moral values? Because it's trying to tackle, because of its origins are in Victorian era, where there was this very strong sense of morality weighing down on people.
Yeah.
And so how does this kind of play into spiritual practice in the sense of both acknowledging that there are these like moral values and also suggesting that there's a reason to maybe challenge them?
Well, that's I like that question. That's really interesting. Well, two things. Let's see. So part of the vampire metaphor that I really like is toxic people do exist. And identifying them often is a moral imperative to us because we want relationships that are healthy. We don't want... obviously people don't want to end up in a bad situation or have a friendship that turns out to be just like somebody constantly trying to one-up you all the time. And so part of that vampire mythos, there's a little sneaky underhanded primer here for don't go with a person who's bad for you, and try to identify that person. But people don't make the best decisions. And so then the morality becomes how do we or do we even have an obligation to save people from themselves and the decisions they make? And can we save ourselves from the poor decisions that we make? And the vampire narrative gives us this in almost like in epic terms, because very often a vampire is immortal. And many of them spend their time saying things like, I wish I hadn't done this, but now I'm stuck. Right? You think about Interview with a Vampire, where you have these long-lived vampires who are a couple of them are really doubting of that decision. They're like, oh no, if only I hadn't done this. There's a wonderful manga a Japanese comic that I love called Millennium Snow, where the two main characters, one of them, the boy is a vampire, and the girl, the main character, she has a heart condition and she could die. She very much wants immortality. And he says, this is a curse and I don't want to give it to you. And so even though they are very, very, very attracted to each other, the story plays out with her saying, you could save my life. And him saying, I love you so much, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. And both of them trying to come to a place where they can accept that answer from each other. And so from a modern spiritual standpoint, we might say, what are the consequences of our decisions? Obviously, none of us is immortal. None of us has to worry about living forever and getting bored and that kind of thing. But what if we make a bad decision? How long does it follow us? Again, and we're back to it follows. But all of these things, swirl around the same idea. Human nature is to move forward for better or for worse. And if we make a bad decision, how do we deal with that? Who do we ally ourselves with? Who will help us the most going forward?
Now, you've brought up mangas a few times, and you were in Japan for a while. Mangas and anime have always fascinated me because unlike American animation, or it's been changing, but basically American animation tends to have in their head it's aimed for children.
Yes.
And that it's simplified and the message is kind of in the forefront. Japanese anime and mangas are not specifically aimed only at children. They're aimed at a much broader audience, and they tend to be, because I ran an anime and manga club in my son's middle school. And what I loved about those is they brought up so much complexity.
Yes.
And they brought up some really fascinating ideas. And talking about this reminds me of Death Note.
Yes.
Which there's a horrible American version out now.
No.
But the original Japanese manga and the anime series, this notion of there's a Death Note book where if you write in it, you can basically foretell the death of someone. You can say...
you can make it happen.
You can make it happen, and it can be way in the future or immediate, and you can write specifics. But the thing that's interesting about it is the moral questions it raises, because one of the characters is... I believe he's the son of a police officer.
Yeah, he's the son of the officer in charge of investigating all of these mysterious deaths.
So he finds this notebook, and his initial response is what we would have, like, oh, if we had the ability to ferret out these evil people who are getting away with murder, literally, we could do good in the world.
It's true.
And so that's his starting point.
But
then he becomes, kind of pumped up with this godlike sense, and it's, just somebody who annoys me, maybe.
Yeah, that's the problem.
The moral questions that raised, that's not a conventionally horror genre, the Death Note, but it brings up ideas that are definitely horrific.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing to keep in mind about manga and anime is that the attitudes that I encountered when I lived there was that it's cheap throwaway entertainment. Yes, it's written for adults, and some of it's obviously written for children, but many adults, are they might read it on the train and they'd throw it out when they were done. I don't think it has the kind of following that comics do here in America. The other thing to keep in mind is that what's considered inappropriate to share with children is very different in Asia. I was a little flabbergasted by some of the things I saw. One of the horror manga that I really love, though, and that is most definitely not for children, is the work of Junji Ito. This guy, if we could resurrect H.P. Lovecraft and make him lose all his racist nonsense, these two men together would create a horror manga that would end the world. It would be so terrifying we'd get a heart attack from just looking at it. But Junji Ito was, I think in his previous work, he was a dental hygienist, and he came to manga a little bit later. He didn't take the usual career path, but he writes these stories and he draws these things that have to do, there's a lot of body horror, and he nails body horror. He knows what makes people squirm. But I think he also explores the horror of conformity, or the idea that, that in order to be in a homogenous society, you have to lose a part of yourself. And when you start losing that stuff that makes, that makes you different or that makes you strong, what happens? And so his works, if you haven't read them, he's done a lot of short stories. I would start with The Horror of Amigara Fault, which is all understatement. It is all about the pull of a bad decision, in this case, a fatal decision, or maybe not a fatal decision, but it's about that urge that we have to do what we know is incorrect, coupled with, the consequences of conformity. And he's great. And that's floating around the internet. But an animated series of his works is coming out, and I am excited and also thinking like, oh no. But he's creepy. And if you've seen Uzumaki, you've seen his work. The manga called Spiral. I think it's translated as Spiral. I would say Vertigo almost too. But yeah, that's a particularly famous work and well worth checking out.
My God, we could speak solely about anime and manga. Probably,
yes, we could.
There's another brilliant one that Monster, I think, was the title.
I'm familiar with it. I haven't read it, unfortunately.
The kind of the premise on that is, what if you save someone who turns out to be a serial killer? It's I think I read it when it first came out, and I believe what it was is there was a situation where there was a murder scene and a young child, and they think the child is one of the victims, and they take the person to the hospital, save them, and it turns out that the kid, I think, was the killer. But whatever it turns out is the doctor has saved someone who turns out to do evil things. Wow. And again, you have that moral question and the thoughts of if you could go back and do it again, or that's what I really love about so much of the Japanese anime and manga, is that it's raising these questions that prevent you from making quick, simple decisions.
It's like a nice update of the EC horror, right? it's and I love EC, but I notice it moves along very quickly. Whereas manga, because of the way it's published and the format and the serialization, you have more time to explore those issues, and that's really nicely done. I love that.
Now, the stuff we've been talking about so far has been horror.
Yes.
But there's some lighthearted horror where if you don't want to venture into some really morally complex ground or some gruesome horror, you could try something like Beetlejuice.
Oh, Beetlejuice is the best. It's a horror movie with training wheels. It has some really frightening images. There's some wonderful practical special effects in it. But I think at its core is just the most loving heart. It's so wonderful. This film made a strong impression on me as a child. There's a moment where Lydia Dietz, who's moved into a house that turns out to be haunted, she's played by Winona Ryder in like full-on goth phase, and she plays this very goth teenager, very disaffected.
I am utterly alone. By the time you read this, I will be gone, having jumped, having plummeted off the Winter River Bridge.
And she's been hinting for about half the film how she wants to kill herself. There's her parents are, I think they're very distant. They're kind people, but very self-centered and not. She has issues. But there's a really wonderful moment in that movie that's always stuck with me, where the two resident ghosts who she's gotten to know urge her not to commit suicide because death is not that great.
What's going on? Beetlejuice. He told me that if I let him out, he would take me to the other side to find you.
No, Lydia. We're dead.
I want to be dead, too.
No. Lydia. Being dead really doesn't make things any easier.
Listen to her on this, Lydia. This is something we know a lot about.
that heart has always stuck with me. That's just that message is so persuasive and so real. And there's just so many funny moments in that movie. There's the great use of music. Also, Danny Elfman is having the time of his life. And then there's a working scale model of the town that they live near that becomes like the source of so much comedy. And I think that's just ingenious. And I would recommend that to people who are thinking, well, I don't really like horror movies, but I want to try it out. Go slow. Don't see something that you know is going to bother you. It's okay to be uncomfortable, but don't hit 11 right away. Maybe start with a 2. That's you don't want to get to the point where you can't unsee things. So, yeah.
Now, if we want to go the opposite direction, there's also something like Alien.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that movie. And the advantage of that movie is that, to me, the horror is offset by the sheer badassness of Ellen Ripley. She is phenomenal. And often, when I'm in a scary situation, like, she's one of the names I run through. I'm like, what would Ripley do here?
Get away from her, you bitch!
When you see a character like that, particularly for me, a woman, but, obviously your listeners will have people, characters they resonate with. When you see them confronting something terrifying and not backing down, not giving up, that is one of the best spiritual moments for me, because spiritual practice should give you strength. We live in a very complicated world. There are many frustrations, many questions. And sometimes, even if you are the strongest person that you know, sometimes you need a little bucking up. And that's okay to admit. And by watching other people go through those same struggles, you gain a little extra. Right? You gain a little extra for yourself. And that's just fantastic. Yeah.
So if you were to pick out maybe 3 films to recommend people as like a little primer, a little starter on your
that's
horror.
Tough.
Yeah, I know. Anytime you have to narrow down,
yes,
it's always a difficult task. But if somebody were to say like, I'm not quite sure I get this notion of horror as spiritual practice, where might you say, all right, how about you start here and then come back and talk to me later?
Well, for starters, I think the best way to get into horror is to move kind of sideways from things that you already like. So if you really enjoy, kind of high literature, Regency, Jane Austen, I'd recommend The Others with Nicole Kidman, since that's a haunted house period film, that's just beautifully shot. And even if the scary parts of it make you jump, you can still, look around and appreciate the craft of the storytelling as well. If you love science fiction, then you're in luck. There's so much crossover. And I had a lot of people tell me after the sermon, they said, oh, I would never watch a horror film. And that's fine. If that's not what you're into, you don't have to do this. On YouTube, there are many short horror films, and I recommend, seeing some of those. That's a good way to get started if you don't want to do an entire feature film. There's one that the movie Lights Out was based on, and the title of which unfortunately escapes me, but it's like a 5-minute film. It's supremely scary, but it's such an example of compact, efficient storytelling. I recommend the heck out of that. I would say if you haven't seen Beetlejuice, I'd recommend you go there. I'd say start, if you're really, really nervous, maybe go to a classic comedy. The first scary movie, and I put scary in quotes, that I plan to show my son, who's 7, is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, because all the monsters are there. You have some setup of like jump scares, but there's so much comedy. The whole scariness of the whole thing is completely offset. And that's probably where I would start. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend showing your children, really terrifying things. But you could also go to classic film. I feel like there are some films that, to be culturally literate, it would help. Jaws is another good example of that, because, that movie completely changed the way we view the summer blockbuster. And even if, you're scared of the fake, admittedly very fake shark, you can appreciate this movie for the type of storytelling that we see now. You can look, I think the human actors in it, just do epic jobs. I really enjoy many parts of this film, and it's not ultimately so terrifying. Now, I know some people said, "Oh, I'll never go in the water again." Well, I don't think you have to worry about Jaws, happening, as long as you're careful and you don't do anything foolish. But the final film that I recommend to people is Get Out.
Sir, can I see your license, please?
Wait, why?
Yeah, I have state ID.
No. He wasn't driving.
I didn't ask who was driving. I asked to see his ID.
Yeah, why? That doesn't make any sense.
Here.
You don't have to give him your ID because you haven't done anything wrong.
Baby, it's okay. Come on. Anytime there is an incident, we have every right to ask.
Bull.
Ma'am,
Everything all right, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm good. Get that headlight fixed. And that mirror.
Thank you, officer.
And this one in particular, for the current political situation we find ourselves in, particularly understanding the consequences of racism. For many white people, I think the idea that you are discriminated against in a certain way is alien to them. Or they may say, well, they might say, well, no, that doesn't exist. I don't believe it because I've never experienced that. And what the film Get Out allows you to do is sort of see the consequences of that denial of racism. And it tackles all our primary fears, the fear of losing yourself, the fear of not being heard, the fear of, the fear of people oppressing you in a very specific and disturbing body horror way. It's a violent film, but the violence it's not gratuitous. It's not violence for the sake of violence. It feels earned in the context of the story. And honestly, the first few times it happened, I was cheering for the character to do that violence because we'd seen the stuff that was happening to him and was going to happen to him if he did not commit those acts of violence, and it was horrifying. And I enjoyed it. I would recommend it to a lot of people. It's scary. That's a good place to start. That's where I would start.
Well, and that's a great one. That came out this year, so
Yes.
It's a new film. And again, you're right. It taps into that loss of identity
Yes.
as well, which is a terrifying thing, in this sense of being invisible,
Yes.
of not being seen. And, in a certain way, it kind of ties back to the very origins of zombie films when you
Exactly.
go back to the voodoo tradition, because that was all about oppression and slavery.
Exactly.
And this sense of another person controlling you, as
Yeah.
opposed to the George Romero zombies, which
Yeah.
are, they've been bitten and infected, and they crave human flesh, but it's not this other person kind of trying
Yeah.
to control or oppress you.
Exactly. And this actually, the interesting thing about Get Out is that it has a scientific veneer, but really it boils down to that witchcraft idea of somehow we're going to do this thing. Right. I don't want to give anything away for people who haven't seen it, but I thought it was a really unique twist, and that Jordan Peele had some really fantastic ideas that played out really well on the big screen.
And putting you in that other position, giving you
Yes.
that point of view
Yeah.
of someone whose position you might not understand, like getting you to see something from a different point of view, which is a
Yes.
spiritual thing as well.
Absolutely. That's the other great gift that we can give to ourselves, is if we can understand another person's perspective. Literally, we talk about putting ourselves in other people's shoes, but that's a hard thing to do. And often a work of fiction makes it more acceptable and easier to understand, rather than, listening to the news or, reading the paper, which, has often the opposite effect. I think people just kind of shut down, whereas in a story, it's like it's in the abstract, and you can deal with it on a level that's not necessarily yourself, and only later you can bring that closer to you and your own experience, and synergize those two things.
Well, and I think that's the great thing about pulp culture, is that there are messages, sometimes deliberate, sometimes unintentional, But there are messages in pop culture that can reach people who would not be reached by a sermon in a church or by a news article or by something that was very on point to trying to give you a message.
Yeah. Oh no, this is so true. Like I'm always amazed at how many people have strong feelings about Harry Potter. It can be, and it's like it's all different aspects of that story, that time period and the universe and the rules for magic. People who I do not expect to have feelings about Harry Potter will see my t-shirt and they'll say, you know what I don't like? I don't like how Snape got treated. Or they'll say, well, like I've had one person say to me, she saw my Ravenclaw sweater and she's like, I don't like you, I'm a Slytherin. I was like, what? But that people feel that so deeply. And then we ask ourselves, this whole, like, what house do you belong to? Well, what do you value in life? It's a really easy way to quickly delineate that. But then we get to deeper and more complicated questions like, are all Slytherins really born evil? Is being ambitious necessarily, an evil trait? How do we temper that? And, why aren't there some Slytherins who are like, hey, we're not on board with this Draco Malfoy, like, back off. But that the universality of that narrative, is just fabulous. And the same thing for Lord of the Rings, that people feel that particular narrative, the way it's told, and especially with the Peter Jackson films, appeals so universally because it puts everybody in that position, and in many complicated moral positions of these characters, Frodo and Sam, even Boromir. As there's a guy who makes a bad decision and pays for it. But we still value him very greatly because a lot of people could understand his desire to take the ring for himself and use its power in service of his own people. A lot of people would make that choice, no matter what the consequences were. But yeah, I love pop culture, and I'm hoping to do more sermons about it. I'd love to bring in more comic book stuff, since we're lucky enough to have Comic-Con here in San Diego, and I'm hoping I can do a Star Wars one, and just because it's not something, it's throwaway entertainment. Most people think, I just see this, it doesn't matter. But then, years later, you're still thinking about that one scene in Half-Blood Prince where Harry should have done this thing, right? It's still happening. And it's still happening.
Well, you mentioned like wearing a Harry Potter shirt. I have this custom-made Star Wars dress that I love. And when people see it, like I have so many people just come up to me and just somebody will say like, "May the Force be with you," or just like, "Oh, Star Wars! I remember seeing that." And you get this connection with people. And one of the things I was talking to my son, I said, I always have fun when I wear this dress because total strangers walk up to me and share some Star Wars memory with me. Like, the dress is made from these sheets. Like, my brother had those sheets. I remember them. And we saw Star Wars when I was, like 10 years old or whatever. But it's like, it creates this odd sense of community.
It is fantastic, right? At least you have that shared bond with strangers. I mean, unless you're a Ravenclaw and they're Slytherin. Like, I don't know what to do in that case. There's very little we can do. But that's the other thing. It creates that sense of community that I think a lot of people really would like to have. The internet is fantastic, and I love it. But it's not the same as meeting people in person or talking about the things you love, and that's when you see somebody in person, usually the reason I'm so happy during Comic-Con, I have a smile plastered my face the entire time because I know these people, right? And they know my t-shirts, and I get into the most random conversations with the most lovely people, over like the smallest thing we have in common, and like the noticing of details or, the debates and all this fun stuff. And horror movie fans, I've noticed it's the same way. Everyone has strong feelings on particular directors or, which monster is the best or which, Freddy versus Jason, although I heard that confrontation was not that exciting after all. Or I have a friend who she doesn't watch any horror movies except the Alien and Predator franchises. And for Alien versus Predator, she was like, I'm there. She was so excited. And I'm like, okay, that's how she deals with like scary things, I think, is that she watches those movies and, she's memorized most of them at this point, but they're almost a religious experience for her to go and, watch them and do that thing. So
Well, and Comic-Con is a mecca where we all make the pilgrimage to.
Yes.
And I mean, I feel like I can tell the difference between the Comic-Con fans who've been going for a long time from the people who are only coming for maybe the Hollywood panels. Because people who complain about waiting in line, I feel like on a certain level that's part of the charm of Comic-Con, because you are guaranteed to be in line with someone who's as geeky as you are.
Oh, yeah.
And you're going to find, unless you go to the wrong panel, like you go to something where
It's
you
true.
don't actually like it,
Yeah.
then you're going to be in line with people who you can't share values with. But, I was in the line for, I think, Shaun of the Dead when they had a panel, or Spaced, I think is actually a panel for Spaced. And it's like, oh, yeah, so we can talk about all the episodes and all the little details and the Easter eggs and, and a couple hours in line is not that bad.
No, some of the best conversations I've ever had have been on the trolley with people in costume, about what their hopes for the day are. I love that, or just seeing, people in costumes doing paperwork, like Batman has to sign this release form. That's wonderful. But yeah, I've met such wonderful people, and we've had such amazing talks. I was in line for the Doctor Who panel a couple of years ago, and this guy introduced himself to me. He said, I'm from England, and I love comics so much I named my daughter Storm. And I was like, dude, you're my kind of dad. And we had the nicest conversation for that, 45 minutes we were waiting. And it's one of my happiest memories. And the same thing, goes for horror movie too, that I was there with you in that theater. That I screamed, at that particular jump scare. Or when we went and saw It, my husband knows that it was me going, fuck, 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 every 10 seconds at particular scenes because I was so worked up, But that's a common thing that we share and that we both remember. And, a lot of people don't want to admit their vulnerabilities, but that's ultimately what you end up doing. Mm-hmm. When you meet someone who shares the same values as you and who likes the same pop culture as you, you're opening yourself up in a way that most of the time we don't dare. Geekdom and fandom and nerdy things are more cool now, but there's still a stigma, to being out about it all the time. But when you attend a movie that you're a fan of, or if you go to an event like that and you spend time with other people who are like you, with your tribe, then that primal part of you is satisfied, and it's just so good. And I think it's akin to a spiritual practice. It doesn't have to be necessarily religion or Christian God, but it's a human thing, and it makes us whole in ways that are really important that we don't always get.
We've been talking mostly about recent films or contemporary films. You did mention the Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, but I wanted to ask, how do you feel about those Universal horror films, the original ones like Frankenstein?
Too.
How do you? I mean, those were great.
Oh, those are wonderful. And I'm a sucker for black and white, so okay. No, it's amazing. When I first watched the Murnau Nosferatu, I think we did that as a double feature with Shadow of the Vampire, which is that's a good double feature. Even though it wasn't particularly scary, and things that frighten us have changed, you could still feel the presence of that film kind of radiating at you. When Nosferatu stands up in that coffin with his clawed hands crossed on his chest. When I show that to my students in humanities class, because we do talk about, I did it in English this time because we were reading Dracula for Halloween, or an excerpt. I said, this might not seem that scary to you, but think about for people who'd never seen this image before. It had up until that point, it only been in their imagination and maybe one illustration that went with the text. And think about seeing that if you'd never seen a movie before and how frightening it would be. And I think it still has a lot of potency, right? That it's one vision of this creature, and yes, it's in black and white and without a sound, without dialogue, but there's still something about it, that shadow creeping along the wall, it's right there in the feels, if you want to put it that way. It's right there in that zone of I'm uncomfortable. I don't like this, even though it's not that sophisticated and not that frightening, but it still appeals to that sense. And yes, the Frankenstein has produced so many classic parodies and so forth. And yeah, Yeah.
Well, it seems like this. We recently did a few years ago the Universal Horror series where we showed all the Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman, The Mummy, all those films, and they're just such amazing films, and they really do, especially Frankenstein. Frankenstein really just has so much like nuance to it and levels of interpretation that it seems like a great film to kind of start people off on for horror.
That would be a good place to start. And then I would urge people, if they haven't read the Mary Shelley, to go there and check that out. It's a very thoughtful piece of writing.
Yeah.
In many ways. And the monster, the creature, is actually a really thoughtful creature. He reads Paradise Lost, to gain his knowledge of human nature, when that's for better or for worse. But this conflict of the idea of something that you create is wrong. All right, there's that. I also love that Mary Shelley apparently wrote this while spending time with her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron. And knowing what we do about Lord Byron in particular, I would probably pen a horror novel at some point, because that guy, that must have gotten really old really fast. So I can understand why she wanted to tell his story, but I think she also does something uniquely feminist, which is to make a male character and probably a male audience sympathize with a fear of childbirth. Right? Because the idea that Dr. Frankenstein creates this thing, which then turns out to be wrong somehow. That's another primal fear we have, particularly surrounding women's bodies and childbirthing, and the idea that something that grew inside of you is wrong, or that you have this alien thing in there, and it's a profoundly disquieting idea. So yeah, that would be a great place to start too. Yes, absolutely.
So you have plans to do more of these sermons?
I sure do.
Tell people where they can find information. If they decide that they want to maybe go to one of these, where can they find information about what you do?
I belong to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of San Dieguito. That's uufsd.org. These upcoming sermons are usually put up by the month. I will try and update my Facebook page. If you go to Catherine Buffington, I'll try to put the public entries of what I'm doing next, so you can come and see that. And yeah, hopefully we'll do a couple more. I'd really love to do some comic book stuff. I'd like to talk about 6 Feet Under in more detail, like all of these things. I have a lot of ideas.
And if you want to leave people with one kind of notion about this, what do you want people to take away from this idea of horror movies as spiritual practice? What would you like them to take away from this? Should they go and see some films? Should they rethink some of the things they've already seen? What kind of takeaway should they have?
Well, okay, so obviously, if you aren't going to like a horror film, if you know in your bones that it's going to be too intense or too scary, don't rush out and subject yourself to something hard. But if you're thinking, I don't like how frightened I am all the time, I think there are some really great places where horror films would give you the opportunity to both purge that bad emotion and move forward from it. And, make that lateral move. If you like one genre that's not horror, try to find a horror, crossover, because chances are you're going to find one. There's a ton of those things. If you are a scaredy cat, there is no shame in reading IMDb to find out the ending or the level of violence. There's also a website dedicated to Does the Dog Die? And if you're like me and you're tender-hearted, maybe you need to know that before you go into a movie. Okay, and again, no shame. But confronting what makes us afraid it can only be a good thing. And it doesn't have to be the most intense thing ever. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I went to the midnight showing of this film that's my worst fear. Don't do 0 to 60 in 10 seconds. But getting to a point where your worst fear doesn't define your actions or hold you back is a really good goal. And that's what I think horror movies can do for you, is give you a setting in which you're in control. You can get up and leave, unlike real-life fears that we have where life is happening. A horror movie, you can get up and leave. You can get up and do other stuff. It's all on you. So take control of that fear and don't let it run your life. That's what I would say to people.
Can they also get a sense of values?
Oh, absolutely. What's important to you? How, and even the question, what would I do in a similar situation? This is empowering too, right? Because we know the situation isn't real, but we can begin to prepare for dealing with that level of trauma. Okay, and not necessarily assuming it's going to come and not catastrophizing, but just saying, okay, if there was something akin to that, how would I move forward? What would be important to me? The question that I find people talking about right now is, if the fires came, what items would I rescue from my house? And this is the same form of that question. What would you do? What would you do? Zombie apocalypse, where are you going to hide out? I have friends who have some really detailed answers. Like, they've thought about it, and, and so much time has gone into that plan. But by not, succumbing to that fear and just being like, I'd roll over in a ditch and cry, you've moved past it. And that's a really useful, worthwhile thing. And knowing what you value and what is important to you, or where you stand on the side of morals, this also helps you define nebulous things, in life. And it can help you identify people who might be toxic. It can help you identify concepts that bother you. And it can help you get at the why. Why are these things important? Why, are these values important to me? Why does this one ideology appeal to me, and why does another one not? Because thinking about that only leads us to a greater understanding of ourselves and the world. And ultimately, that's what makes life really awesome.
Well, I want to thank you for talking to me. We could have talked for hours more.
I know.
Because there's so many films.
I know.
Like, every time you mention one, I go, oh, but there's that other one.
I know. Well, thank you for having me. And if anyone wants to come and chat horror movies, I'm always up for that. And I'm also up for anime and comics and so many other things. And I really believe there is, for everyone out there, there is a comic, there is a horror film, there is really any genre film, okay? And there is a book. There are all of these things that will appeal to you. You just have to be willing to put in the time to find it.
Or talk to the right person.
Or talk to the right person.
Point you in the right direction.
Exactly.
And that's the great thing about comic book stores.
Oh, right. Yes.
Is that you can talk to people who know their stuff and can point you in the right direction.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. That was awesome.
That was Catherine Buffington. She's a worship associate at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of San Diego. And we've been talking about movies, horror movies in particular, as spiritual practice. Thanks for listening to another edition of listener-supported KPBS Cinema Junkie podcast. If you're feeling generous this holiday season, consider leaving a review for the podcast on iTunes, or just recommending it to a friend. A personal recommendation is the best way to get new listeners for the show. You are the best advertisement we have. You can also donate to support the show at kpbs.org/feedthejunkie. Cinema Junkie and I will be taking a short break for the holidays, but we'll return in January with an episode on film noir. Thanks for listening, and happy holidays. Considering the theme of this show, I'll go out with this inspirational holiday tune. Till our next Film Fix, I'm Beth Accomando, your resident cinema junkie.
Oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu, oh, great Cthulhu, great Cthulhu, great Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu, oh, great Cthulhu. Thin, gluey, Wagganaga, Vatagen, oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu. Thin, gluey, Wagganaga, Vatagen, oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu, oh, Cthulhu. Shall rise and ancient, and he shall rise.
KPBS On Demand is supported by Splatero, helping homeowners pay off debt by offering streamlined access to your home's equity with no additional monthly payments or new debt. Splatero provides a lump sum of payment in exchange for a share of your home's future value. Pre-qualification is available at splatero.com.